Today's trivia question, we'll start with that, would be that, and this will be really narrowed down because we're going to save time. But in one of the letters to Timothy, because Paul was telling Timothy about these two individuals, there are two people said to be handed over to Satan because of their blasphemy. Who were these two that were handed over to Satan? Today's trivia. See if I got anything else from Johnny here. Anybody got that? Anybody want to unmute and answer that? What two individuals were said to have been handed over by Satan, handed over to Satan, basically by Paul, when Paul is telling Timothy. It's in the Bible. That makes it Bible trivia.
Alex, let's see. Hymettus and Hymettus, I already say that. It's Alexander.
Yes, I'll believe that answer. So I call it Hymenius, but that's okay. It could be Hymenaeus. It could be, could be Hymenius or something. But anyway, it's Greek. So this is 1 Timothy 1. You can go and turn there. I'll start at verse 18. The answer is in verse 20. 1 Timothy 1:18. Timothy, my son, I give you this instruction in keeping with the prophecies that were made about you, so that by following them you may fight the good fight, holding on to the faith and good conscience. Since some, have rejected these, and so have shipwrecked their faith. I think Paul would understand a shipwreck. Among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. It's kind of an interesting comment. I don't know why Paul would have the desire or the encouragement or the instruction to turn someone over to Satan. And I suspect this is a figure of speech, which really means basically turn them away from the church. If the church was a fortress against Satan, then they're being thrown out of the fortress to be attacked by Satan in the world. So I think that was probably largely more figurative, but it's kind of an interesting comment that he made. And you don't necessarily have to turn to these, but I just wanted to mention a couple other verses because we're going to be back here in 1 Timothy first. But a couple other verses here in 2 Timothy, Paul mentioned, let's see, this 2 Timothy 2:16, avoid godless chatter because those who indulge in it will become more and more ungodly, and their teaching will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who wandered away from the truth. They say the resurrection has already taken place. They destroy the faith of some. Nevertheless, God's solid foundation stands firm, sealed with this inscription: the Lord knows those who are his. And everyone who confesses the name of the Lord must turn away from wickedness. So it sounds like there, Alexander and Philetus had declared that they either didn't believe in God, which would fit with the blasphemy mentioned in 1 Timothy, or that if they had indeed confessed the name of God, then they should turn from wickedness, and that they hadn't truly confessed the name of God because they hadn't turned from wickedness. And then Alexander gets his line over in 2 Timothy 4:14. Alexander, the metal worker, did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. You too should be on your guard against him because he strongly opposed our message. Whether that was the same Alexander or not, it's hard to say. That was kind of a common name in the day, kind of like Norm. Everybody seemed to be named that, but so it's Alexander would have been a very common occurrence of a name, although it makes sense if he did him a great deal of harm, and that was somebody that Paul had figuratively turned over to Satan, then that makes sense. So I thought we'd start with just a couple of verses in the study that to me are just interesting verses about the devil or Satan that I honestly don't know what to fully make of. But there's one that I think we blow by all the time. or periodically, at least in churches. And that's over at 1 Timothy 3. So let's look at that one. And I'm going to read a few verses starting at 3:1. Hang on a second here. Sorry, just trying to get my other papers a little orderly here. 1 Timothy 3:1. Here's a trustworthy saying. If anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of but one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. So all those things I think we're very familiar with. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? Okay, all things still that we're familiar with. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. I think that's kind of an interesting comment on the devil twice there. One is he must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. Okay, we talked about the conceit of being quite likely a very beautiful cherub, protector of Adam and Eve, protector of the Garden of Eden, protector in Eden, leader maybe of the new humans to try to kind of keep them on track. And then he became conceited, wanted to be like God, so he wanted to disrupt their relationship with God because of his jealousy. All of that fits. And then there's a good reputation with outsiders needed so they will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. Boy, I find that one interesting, because thinking about the devil's trap is easy enough. You think, temptation, become sin-oriented, become self-oriented rather than service-oriented, rather than being one of God's children, try to be more like the world. That's a very simple part, but how would it apply that he has a good reputation with outsiders and fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap, so they will not fall into disgrace into the devil's trap? I think that's kind of an interesting comment on one of the reasons that we have what we know as the bride of Christ, the church and fellowship, is that we do tend to be like those that we're surrounded with, right? And so having a good reputation maybe here might possibly mean a little more to say that he has a reputation as a righteous person, a reputation of good rather than a good reputation. So that's kind of one possible interpretation. The other obviously just is if you're living as a Christian and you're honest and you're prayerful and you're concerned for people's souls, not their person per se, things like that. I mean, obviously that keeps you away from being pulled into a lot of things you shouldn't be pulled into, or the devil's trap. But I found it interesting that of all the things we talk about for our shepherds to, for qualifications, I don't know how often we talk about, well, we got to, see that they've stayed out of the devil's trap. It's kind of an interesting term, I think. So let's go over any thoughts along those lines, by the way, while we happen to be there. No? Okay. If you're making any comments, they're muted. And so I'm going to assume I'm reading your lips right. I can't believe you said that about me, Dan.
I was waving my hand.
Oh, okay. Charles, go ahead.
I was thinking that if you don't have a good reputation with those outside, you may end up defending yourself. I was just thinking about when a politician gets accused of something by somebody that has nothing to do with what their job is. That's a big distraction, and they inevitably get sucked into it, and it just runs them down, occupies their time. And I was wondering if that might be the trap.
And that's absolutely a fair point too. It would be a huge distraction away from doing the the work needed at a local congregation or a local area of the Bride of Christ.
I was
Absolutely.
thinking even more than that, you become self-absorbed because
Mhm.
you're so focused on yourself.
Oh, I think that's very real. Absolutely. It's a good point. You know, it is interesting. And the people I've known that have faced legal trouble who are in the medical realm, you know, whether a partner or a doctor I know from the hospital or whatever, who gets into, you know, some sort of um, legal dilemma, somebody talking about suing them or, you know, suing them for malpractice, almost always it boils down to their comments about their character. You know, I would never do that, you know, because I'm not made that way. Or, you know, I try to treat people with the utmost of respect. That couldn't happen when sometimes things are, you know, frankly, negligent, or, you know, somebody's too tired to come back, check on a patient again overnight or whatever. But it almost always is a character issue that gets brought up. It's rarely the care issue, it's the character issue. And I've always found that kind of interesting because I think it's fully understandable too. I think you're tied so much into the the role that you're in professionally, whether that's in medicine or any other field, that I think it really becomes a personal confrontation rather than a purely professional one. What else on that? Anything else there? Losing papers everywhere. Anybody else? Okay. All right, I'm going to have us do a couple more. Trying to find a marker there. Found it. Couple more verses of interest, and then we're going to talk more about the source of demons or what demons are. So let's turn to Isaiah 8, if you would please. And I'm going to be at verse 18. Isaiah 8:18. Okay, assuming you've had time, punch that into the computer. Here I am, and the children the Lord has given me, is what the prophet is writing here. We are signs and symbols in Israel from the Lord Almighty, who dwells on Mount Zion. When men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? So I just want to raise that as an interesting thought. Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Now let's go ahead and let me read one more similar one, and then we'll go over to the story of Samuel and the Witch of Endor, because I think that is just a fascinating story. So I'm going to turn to Psalm 106, and I'll read a couple of verses. There's a lot here if you want to read through it. Psalm 106, and you know, it's interesting. I'm not sure we study the Psalms a whole lot. I think they mostly kind of appear to people to be a little bit on the dull side. You know, it's sort of a repetitious, you know, I have come before you, you're my warrior, I present myself to you, you fight for me, you know, that type thing, where it's sort of a repetition of verse. The Psalms are very rich on a lot of detail and a lot of meaning for when they were written. And Psalm 106 is essentially a lament of the sins of Israel. So it's kind of a recounting of how Israel turned against God. You might notice, like, for instance, in verse 6, we've sinned as our fathers did. And then down at verse 19, for instance, at Horeb, they made a calf, worshipped an idol cast from metal. Remember, Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are probably the same mount. And then down to verse 28, they yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to lifeless gods. They provoked the Lord to anger by their wicked deeds. And then I'll go down to verse 34. They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord had commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and adopted their customs. They worshiped their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons. Interesting that would all get thrown into one main thing. You have Baal, You have lifeless gods. You have the mentioning of the calf, of course, back at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. And then you have down here at verse 36, they worship idols and they sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons. I want you to just think about all those things as being Israelite issues as we turn over to the story of Saul and the Witch of Endor. I'm turning to it here. I believe to be in 2 Samuel, and for some reason I can't find where it is. Somebody find it for me quickly enough that I feel like I found it myself. I don't know why it's gone. Somebody's been messing with my Bible. Oh, I know why now, because I'm in the wrong book. 1 Samuel, it gotta be 1 Samuel. Who's found it?
Is it 1 Samuel 28?
Thank you. I don't know why I can't find it. Good grief. Turn to it all the time. Thank you. For some reason, I was saying 17. That's not correct, obviously. We'll do 1 Samuel 28. Thank you so much. Yes, well, you know, that's it. Actually, you did know that. So that is it. All right, so 1 Samuel 28. Always found this to be a fascinating passage. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." David said, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." Achish replied, "Very well, make you my bodyguard for life." Now Samuel's dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. Interesting little comment there, just sort of thrown in. So what does that mean? Well, the obvious, there were spiritists and mediums in the land, and he expelled them. So they had been there. The Philistines assembled and came to set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who's a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." "There's one in Endor," they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said. "Bring up for me the one I name." But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." "What does he look like?" he asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel. I think he was online with us last week too. I think I saw an old man in a robe. But anyway, Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God's turned away from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with terror because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and night. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, Look, your maidservant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now, please listen to your servant. Let me give you some food so that you may eat and have the strength to go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his men joined the women in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground, and sat on the couch. The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. He took some flour, kneaded it. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. Then she set it before Saul and all his men, and they ate. That same night, they got up and left. All right, so this one little chapter that hid from me for a while there is just full of spiritual issues, right? So I think it's absolutely incredible. First, as we mentioned already, Saul had cast out mediums and spiritists from the land. There, you know, and again, not mean to be too obvious, but if he cast them from the land, they had existed in the land. That, therefore, you can make that extrapolation that spiritists and mediums exist, and that they were there in Israel at that time. What are spiritists and mediums? But, you know, what we might call today fortune tellers and witches, I guess, is the most proper term. I mean, he went to a witch of Endor, and a medium is one who translates information from a dead source or a non-human source to a human source. They mediate or serve as a medium, that transfer of information. A spiritist might be more notably, like I was saying, like a fortune teller, kind of trying to bring about a view of, oh, I see something, it must be present. So the difference between a spiritist and a medium basically is the spiritist tends to translate their own vision to a person, and the medium actually theoretically negotiates conversation between that non-human entity and a human entity. So those existed. Shortly thereafter, we see after verse 3, where they existed in the land and he had cast them out, saw that Saul was afraid of the Philistines, so he inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. So let's think about that there are ways that he was able to consult God, or try to consult God, and dreams being acceptable. You know, we talked about before that there are dreams and visions in the Bible that seem very angelically oriented, very oriented angels. You know, angels, just on quick review, angels appeared as men, as chariots and surrounding armies, as invisible, and then appeared, like with Balaam and the donkey, as figures crossing a land, like on the angel that brought about the plague when David counted his mighty men. You might consider that an angel is included in the Passover, which, since this is Palm Sunday, is a very appropriate time to be talking about Passover, but that also in Exodus 12, it really specifies that God went through the land and killed the firstborn. And then, of course, there were various visions, dreams, like Joseph had the dream that he needed to take Mary and the baby Jesus to Egypt, for instance. So there, and then they also appeared as angels, like when good grief, I'm suddenly drawing a blank on the messenger angel appeared to Mary and to Zechariah before him. Oh, where'd my mind go? Michael and what's that angel? Yes, Gabriel. I can't believe I forgot that name. Oh, it's such a hard name to remember. But anyway, so there were angels that appeared as angels as well. So it would be very reasonable to have the Lord come to Saul in a dream when Saul had inquired of him. So that's a reasonable thing. And then, of course, by prophets, Saul had experience with prophets. He had experience with the judge Samuel, who had died, who, by the way, had declared that he wouldn't see Saul again before he died because Saul had rejected him with not defeating the Amalekites, not consulting of God through Samuel. And so what about Urim? What is Urim?
Kind of like dice.
Yeah, kind of like, I think that's probably as fair a comparison as there is. They apparently, there was Urim and Thummim. We may be familiar with that term from the priestly garment. So it's basically consulting a priest. So here he's inquiring of God, and he said, God didn't come to me in a dream or by a prophet or by a priest. And the Urim and Thummim were kind of a weird deal. They were hanging on the garments of the priesthood. And apparently, if the Urim showed when the priest consulted God for an answer, then it was to be a favorable result for the people. If the Thummim showed, that was to be a less favorable or a defeat of God's people. So it was kind of like dice or a lucky, I hate to even use that term one time about God's will, but sort of a lucky charm that said, here's the answer based on what God tells the answer to be. So that's why it's not lucky. It wasn't luck, it was God's will. But Urim and Thummim were both devices found with the ephod. Now, at this point in time, the ephod that was properly to be used was not available to Saul. The ephod that would have been available to the high priest, because Saul wasn't where the high priest, he wasn't with God, with the high priest like he should have been, because the background of this whole story was the Ark of the Covenant had been lost to the people. And David eventually went back and brought it back after, you know, it annoyed the Philistines and they all ended up having plagues and trouble from it. So the Ark of the Covenant was unavailable. Therefore, the Urim and Thummim approach to the Ark and to God were unavailable. So basically, all these things are sort of spiritual ways to get the answer from God. Well, they are spiritual ways, the dream or the Urim or the prophets. But none were given to Saul because Saul was living in sin at this point, having not approached God in the right way. So then he almost immediately, it seems, it says he inquired of the Lord, didn't get the answer. Then Saul said, verse 7, find me a woman who's a medium and I'll go inquire of her. So, you know, it almost strikes me that Saul probably had used a medium before. We don't know. I mean, I have nothing to base that on other than my own impression, but I kind of think he probably did, because he had at least enough familiarity to go seek him out. I think, you know, maybe desperation brings about things you'd never, ever, ever do or approach, but I think it just seems odd. Johnny?
You think all the mediums were women?
It's a great question. You know, that is, you know, that's really, I hadn't even pondered that issue. All the mediums I know that are mentioned by name in the Bible are women, because that's this one. But you know, that is a fair question for sure. I think it's interesting. I don't know how often any of you ever gone and have your fortune told anywhere. Sorry, unfair question of the day. I'm hoping not, by the way. I'll just point that out. But you know, my perception is that the fortune tellers of the world are women. I mean, it's kind of interesting, but if I think about, I've actually had some patients who are gypsies that have offered to present my fortune to me. I almost couldn't run the other way fast enough. I don't want that done. And also, another time I had a Muslim individual give me an Islamic name that means that I listen to the spirits, which I thought was kind of scary. And so I wanted to run the other way from that too. I don't want to be drawn into a non-godly arrangement, you know. But anyway, all that's to say, the only ones I actually would think of would tend to be women. That's an interesting question. When we get another couple of verses down the line, I think we'll see that men were culpable in spiritual issues too. But it is interesting that maybe something about not having the real priestly role. You know, when we talk about the priests of Baal and Asherah, the implication is that the priests of Baal were all men, and maybe the women were more on the one-to-one basis with some of the spiritual warfare just because of the culture. Interesting question. So when they went to the woman and said, consult the spirit for me and bring me the one I named, they go down to verse 9. She said, it could be a trap. And then verse 10, Saul brought God into it, which is really also kind of a fascinating part of the spiritual journey here. Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this. Was it Saul's right to say God wouldn't punish her? Or that the land, she was worried about the king. She didn't know this was Saul initially. She was worried about being punished by the law of the land or the king. But, I think that Saul improperly brought God into this. And it reminds me of the teaching of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount that says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, but don't swear by the temple. And I think the reason you don't swear by the temple and say, oh, I swear by the temple that this will happen or whatever, is the temple isn't yours to give up. If you're wrong, you can't say, oh, well, okay, go take the temple. It's yours now. You shouldn't pull things in that are not your domain to have the legitimate ability to answer that issue with. And that's, I think, the huge component to not swearing by anything, because then you don't want to have to pay if you must become honest in your swearing of something. So in this case, he is saying, swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you'll not be punished. And, apparently she wasn't, but I still think it's really odd that he had given up on God, went and found a medium and was calling God into the situation. And I think inappropriately so. So then she said, verse 11, whom shall I bring up? And he said, bring up Samuel. And it didn't seem to be difficult. It strikes me that he said, bring up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out and said, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So she knew something happened there when she brought up Samuel. And then more interestingly, maybe at 13, the woman said, I see a spirit coming up out of the ground. What does it look like? An old man wearing a robe. And then Saul immediately knew it was Samuel. And then maybe even more interesting than that was Samuel spoke. Samuel said, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? There was no mention of, by the way, Saul, this is Samuel, and you can't do this. This doesn't occur, right? So I believe the soul, the spirit of Samuel was brought up, and he did converse with Saul. And what else? What happened immediately thereafter? Just to make sure, allow a chance to answer. Ask a question and get an answer. Sounds good. What happened thereafter? Now, this is a good, almost a classic example of, I guess, what I'm thinking. So I'll answer it since nobody seems to be on muting at the moment. And that is that immediately thereafter, he starts talking this conversation between Samuel and Saul. And sure enough, Samuel knows things that are about to happen. He knows things that regular humans didn't know. And I don't think that's because he was a judge when he happened to be still alive, because a judge was presenting the word of God before people, but not particularly in any logical way trying to predict the future. In fact, if you think about it, Samuel went to Jesse and said, I'm told by God to anoint one of your sons, bring him before me, and I'll try to figure out which one it is. And he misselected on 7, or he didn't find the one, and maybe on 6, depending on the translation. And then the youngest son, of course, was David, and he realized that's who God had in mind. So it wasn't like he said, hey, I'm going to go out, find Jesse and anoint his youngest son, David, as king, to be king next after Saul. He followed the teachings and the directions of God, but he didn't seem to have a predictive component to himself. And here, he suddenly, once dead, seemed to know what the future held. How can you make sense of that? Anybody have any theory on that based on what we've talked about?
Well, just that you've mentioned before, that it seems that the dead have that ability to know a little bit about future events.
Yeah, that, and my theory on the why Do you want to expand on that, or do you want me?
No, I want you.
Okay. Just thinking about why would a dead Samuel have an idea what was going to happen the next day to Saul? You know, Saul and his sons would die. The Israelites would be defeated at the hand of the Philistines. He said it very matter of fact, very predictable, very, straightforward. It wasn't, oh, I see this weird vision and something's going to happen to you, like we might picture with a fortune teller. He had the direct word of Samuel that Saul and his sons are going to die as the Philistines defeat him the next day. My feeling on that is, given my belief that this is literal, that the witch of Endor brought up Samuel, and Samuel spoke to Saul, and Samuel is a dead guy, so he was not human. He was, maybe we should use a term like superhuman, in that he wasn't bound by human flesh and time, that he seemed to know what would happen. Remember, we've talked about the challenge for us in viewing God and viewing spiritual warfare and timing of God is that God is not bound by time, because God is. God always has been, and God always will be, and God is not limited by time. We, and I think the forces of Satan, when in Daniel 10, when Michael said, I've come to you, David, as you've asked, but I was detained by the prince of Persia for 3 weeks in a battle. That realm seems to be bound by time. When we talk about somebody being dead, I don't think there's a literal wait for judgment or the end of the world or for God to bring Jesus back. I think that there's just no time. So when Samuel was brought back, I think there were two comments by him that are pretty telling. One is he knew the future events, and I think that was because he was not bound by time, so he could know what would come about. Maybe not, trying to be fair and scriptural about it, since the comment also is made that angels long to know when God will return, and Jesus literally said, I don't know when God's judgment will come. Even the angels don't. Only God the Father knows that. I don't think they know final judgment, but I think they know events. And that leads to the second one, which I think Samuel's irritated to be brought back. He said, why'd you bring me up? And I think it was probably because he wasn't any longer bothered by the idea of time. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen to Israel, whom I've led all these years? I think he was free of that bondage of time, and therefore able to see what event would occur and to be annoyed at sort of being pulled back into that realm. So that leads the craziest thought of how is it that a medium could actually bring somebody up from the grave or up from earth? It says he came up from the ground, right? I don't know if that was literally, he was buried at Ramah. They went to Endor. Ramah and Endor are not the same city. So this was not where he was buried, but he came up from the ground. I don't know if that's figurative or he just sort of was there and there's no better description than that. I don't know what to make of that, but I don't think this was like Jesus raising from the dead and the stone rolling away and him being able to walk out of the tomb. Charles? Yes, Charles?
I'll let you know I'm here.
Yeah, good to see you.
I've never read anything into that necessarily indicates that he had any special knowledge because he was dead. Sometimes prophets knew things, sometimes they didn't. For example, Nathan knew that that Bathsheba's son was going to die.
Yeah, but did he know that because God said, go tell him he's going to die?
Well, I assumed he did.
Yeah.
He knew it and predicted the future. Saul knew that David was going to, Samuel knew that David was going to supplant Saul. And some things they knew, some things they didn't know. I wouldn't necessarily say, well, he knew it because he was dead.
Well, and that's fair. I appreciate that viewpoint. I also think, though, that that's pretty different. I think when the prophet is told by God, go to Saul and tell him, the throne is being taken from you. I've anointed another. That's a little different, I think, than coming back after death and presenting information. Maybe because it only seemed to happen once, that, you know, that there's a very small selection of information to base that on, certainly.
But
But
my
it just
point, I
strikes me.
guess, is to take this one only example that we have of anything like this and extrapolate to a general conclusion. Seems
Sure. So let me, and that's very fair, and I appreciate that view. So let me focus for a moment then on the fact that this was a medium present here, a witch, who was able to bring someone back from the dead. Remember, we just read Isaiah 8:9 there, where it said, don't go consult the dead. Why not call on God instead? How many of us, or do you know anyone who's gone and consulted the dead for an answer to an issue? I dare say I don't think we do know anybody. I don't think I know anybody who should go consult the dead, because God said don't do it. And it's interesting to me that that's not just a figurative, you know, don't go consulting the dead. I think this was something that occurred. I think they did go consult the dead and bring them up. And again, you know, whether that was something Samuel knew only because he was Samuel and a prophet of God, or a judge, but whatever it was, this was an event that was able to be brought about by what I would, by all other scriptural evidence, say was not a work of God's will. This was a work of the dangerous spiritual part of what the Israelites face, and what I think we could properly realize that we can face. So let's look over now at Deuteronomy 18 and read about the rules. Now, I do, you know, I see your point there, Charles, and that's certainly fair, but I still think that the baseline issue exists that she brought up Samuel from the dead. He had been dead, and he talked, you know, he spoke to Saul. So really a bizarre deal. And the other issue that I think is important that I always tend to think about is when I read a rule that's written by God, I always think, you know, why did that have to become a rule? I'm a natural non-law pusher, if that doesn't make any sense unless I explain it. But like, for instance, okay, I've been in an executive role, one type or another, with my group for 25 years now, my business group. And you know, people come to us week after week after week and want a new rule made because somebody did something. You know, somebody left something smelly in the refrigerator, so they want us to make a rule that they'll get a warning if they leave something in the refrigerator, and the second time they do it, we'll execute them, you know, or fire them or whatever we do there. But you know, they're always wanting a new law passed based on really random events. You know, and I always think back to years ago, I happened to be talking to one of our local representatives to the state, one of the state senators, and I asked them, just because we were having the chance to kind of casually talk about politics, I said, what's the most frustrating thing about politics to you? What was the most disappointing thing when you got to the state house? And he said, it's the fact that anybody who has a single chip on their shoulder can pass a law that affects everybody else. And his example was that he personally was an owner of several apartments, and his another guy in the legislature owned a bunch of rental properties. And the guy had lost some property because somebody put an iron on the middle of the rug and burned the rug and left it, and had a scarred rug. And so he tagged a bill onto another, like, you know, water supply along the Rio Grande bill that said if there was a burn in the middle of the carpet, that there could be a fine of $2,000 to that individual. And he said, you know, that was purely he was frustrated over one event and passed the law based on that. So I often think about that in the context of, let's, you know, try to generally do what's right without having to make a law against everything. And then I look at the Old Testament and I see, wow, you know, here in the Old Testament, God had some very specific warnings and laws. And the reason must be they were repeatedly done by the Israelites such that there had to be a law. I mean, honestly, why would you have a law that says you must not sleep with your mother-in-law unless there were Israelites who were sleeping with their mother-in-law? You know, he wouldn't just randomly say, hey, you know, don't do this if it hadn't been a repeated error, I believe. So when we see warnings from God, I think it's because God knew that these are things people are susceptible to and could repeatedly run into trouble with. So let's look at Deuteronomy 18:9. When you enter the land the Lord God has given you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire. Remember, we read that in Psalm 106 a little while ago. Who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Now remember, God's plan was for the Israelites to drive out all the people, and they're the famously named 7 nations. There probably were other miscellaneous scattered ones. What do we know about these nations they were to drive out? But all of them had a false god that was the head of their economy, if you will, the one that they worship the most. Then they usually have a set of other somewhat gods that were under that. And, you know, I've made the comment before that if you're susceptible, say, to storms on the coast, then you're going to want to worship, if you're a pagan society, you're going to want to worship the ocean, the sky, the sun, because it brings forth crops, fertility, god of fertility, because you've got to have crops produced and people produced, possibly the sun, the moon, the stars, because they all affect how weather is and tides, and, you know, various things that you sort of, as a human subject to nature, would find yourself worshiping. So sure enough, like the Philistines had Dagon, who was the god of fertility and the sea, land sea connection they had on the coast. It was sort of the chief god of the Philistines, the chief false god. And then they had several others that they worshiped under that. So when God said, go into the land, wipe out all the people so that you will not be ensnared by intermarrying or worshiping at their places of worship to these false gods, he really meant it. He meant drive them out, destroy them, don't intermingle, don't get messed up in their gods. And we'll read next week, because of time, about how, for instance, even Solomon, the world's wisest man, got ensnared by false gods. And then when I read this, when he says, go into the land and don't practice any of this, sacrificing your son or daughter in the fire, any divination, any sorcery, don't interpret omens, don't engage in witchcraft, don't cast spells, and don't participate those who are a medium or a spiritist or anyone who consults the dead. I believe that that was because all those things existed. So if you had somebody who consulted the dead, that was a sin to stay away from and not do it, then there must be a way that the dead can be consulted, right? Wouldn't that logically follow? If this were a meaningless practice that had nothing to do with it, you know, if I said when I went out to get the newspaper that if it's facing north, I'm going to wear blue that day, or if it's facing west, I'll wear, you know, green, I don't think that's necessarily a spiritual problem, nor is it invoking a power that shouldn't be used. But when God says, don't consult the dead, I think that's a spiritual problem. And that's invoking a power that frankly shouldn't be used. And I think it's interesting that this land was full of people who had these spiritual depravities that were common in that area. So I want to just wrap up, because we're down to the last 3 or 4 minutes. How would you, anybody voluntarily, how would you define demon? How would you define demon in terms of scriptural times or spiritual warfare? Anybody have a thought? I should bring my granddaughter in here to start singing, Johnny. Go ahead. Yes, Johnny. Do you have a thought?
Well, servants of God, servants of the devil, Satan, but I don't know what the equivalent good side of that is. In other words, you got the bad, you got the evil angels, you got good angels. I don't know what the good side equivalent to the demons would be, but they're servants of Satan somehow.
I love that answer. That is an excellent answer because it is appropriately vague. And we really don't. And I mean that I think you're spot on. I think that demons are within the realm of Satan, but I don't think that demons are sort of just bad angels. When we look in scripture, we see angels come to people in many forms. We reviewed those at the top of the hour. When we look in scripture, I don't see verses that indicate that angels come and try to possess people or get consulted from the dead. I mean, are we saying that bad angels are dead? I don't think so. When we, talk about, say, Legion, that Jesus cast the many evil demons into a herd of pigs that, 2,000 pigs cast themselves into the sea. It doesn't imply, Legion was full of bad angels. It says he was full of demons, right? And so I think it's interesting. I don't think that there's a spiritual equivalent of a demon from the bad side that is reflected in some sort of spiritual creature on the good side. And in fact, based on a couple of the scriptures we've read and a couple of things, notice too in Deuteronomy 18, God didn't say steer away from those that practice divination, from the bad angels, from, Satan's angels that fell with him. I think we have this view in mind that Satan was cast from heaven along with a bunch of angels he took with him, maybe a third. I've read somewhere before in other Christian literature outside the Bible that 2/3 of the angels were good and a third were bad and they were cast in. I don't think there's any scriptural proof of that. I think Satan was, it appears to me mostly from scripture, that he was a cherub, one of the angelic forces in heaven, one of the godly creatures in the heavenly realm who rebelled against God and was cast down. I don't particularly see, other than the one verse that says, I saw Satan and his angels being cast down. We all know that that's a third of angels. We all know that they didn't die, that they became demons, whatever. I think if you really look at the issues that talk about sin with demons and the character of demons and the fact that demons seem to know Jesus very quickly when he encountered a demon-possessed individual, and that other people could cast out demons other than Jesus, for instance, in the New Testament. 7 sons of Sceva were trying to, for instance, and that the 12 and the 72 that were sent out were told, cast out demons along your path. That I think that they most represent probably the souls of the evil dead. And whether that includes Samuel or not is really a challenge. So I don't think Samuel is evil, but he was consulted as being dead. Charles?
Remembering that angel means messenger.
Yes.
If you look at 2 Corinthians 12:7, where Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh, the Greek there reads, it says in the English translation is messenger of Satan. The Greek reads an angel of Satan.
Interesting point. That is an excellent point. I hadn't thought about that verse in this context.
I'm
Yeah.
not drawing any conclusions from that.
Well, and that's fair in that I don't think that was a possession by a demon that Paul had. I think it was an annoyance and a spiritual diversion, almost like what you were talking about earlier when somebody falls into the devil's trap, they're spiritually diverted. I think it was an attempt to divert Paul from his task as a young Christian or a Christian evangelist to have this diversion, but I don't think it was a demon possession. So we'll talk. I need to let us go because it's 6 now. We'll talk about that more at in 2 weeks because of Easter next week. I do just want to mention, if you can, I would encourage you to just read a couple of passages, and honestly, it doesn't matter which ones because I think they all apply, and there are a bunch. But just pick a couple of verses in the New Testament there about demon possession. It'd be, if you want to read about the ones that cast the one they possess into a fire, or the girl that was being run as a profit maker in Acts, and the demons were cast out, and her owners, her handlers were upset because they couldn't make money off of her anymore because she was able to foretell the future. If you remember that one. If you want to read about Legion and Matthew 8, no, not Matthew 11 and Mark 8, I think. A very classic story about demon possession. If you want to just read about the fact that demons recognize Jesus before the people seem to recognize Jesus, I think that's very telling as well. And just read some of those, and we'll think about the situation of spiritual warfare and demons next time in that context. I want to just make one brief mention. I think I touched on it last week too, but this is the Holy Week for all Christians everywhere. That we in the Church of Christ have long-term strived is what I'm trying to say. We have striven to avoid terms like Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, other than saying, well, we have Easter and Christmas, but they're no different than other Sundays. We throw that in extremely quickly. And I believe we do appropriately, because we always rejoice in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus to cover our sins. But for the world right now, many people identify it today as Palm Sunday. This is the Holy Week, the Passion Week, and that the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Jesus were this week in history back in that time coming up this. I'm going to just mention through the week into Sunday because of controversy about the dates. But I think that's valuable, just like I think I would never, ever try and make the argument that the birth of Jesus was on Christmas Day, because I don't think that makes any sense by history or logical biblical thought. But I think that when the rest of the world is talking about Jesus, is a great time to invite them to church with you, invite them into a Bible study with you, any of those things that you can do, because it's already a point of discussion. And I think it'd be valuable to use that opportunity to present the truth of Christ to people. And this is the most holy week for Christians because it is the actual date in history that Jesus was selected for sacrifice on Palm Sunday when he was presented into Jerusalem, and then was sacrificed later in the week and then rose from the dead. So for all the controversy surrounding Christmas or whatever other dates you even think to throw in there, Easter is Easter for the reason that it is the first and holy month of the Jewish year. And these are the dates that Jesus was selected and executed and rose from the dead. So having said that, I'll lead us in prayer, and we'll pick up from here in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, it's a great honor to me to get to have this hour of Bible study.